There are some cases where the first thing that disappears is not the evidence, it's the truth. A woman opens her door, a stranger asks for help, and somewhere in the years that follow, a lie gets repeated so many times, it starts to feel like part of the case itself. This is what makes this story so unsettling. Not just the violence, and not just the wait for justice, but the way the truth kept getting buried under borrowed names, half-truths, and misdirection. Because every now and then, a case does not stay cold because there was no evidence. Sometimes evidence does not fail. The story built around it does. This is one of those cases. Welcome back to Murder in the Black. I'm Steph. In June of 1987, in Columbus, Ohio, 77-year-old Anna Mae Florence was attacked inside her apartment. Earlier that day, nothing about Anna Mae's routine suggested it would become the last day of her life. Anna Mae was elderly, and on that day, her sister Lily and Lily's husband Alonzo went to her apartment to check on her. But when they got there, they heard screaming from inside. Lily ran next door to call police. Alonzo tried to get into the apartment, and while he was trying to make his way inside, the door suddenly unlocked. He opened it and found Anna Mae on the floor covered in blood. At the same time, the suspect, who had apparently been hiding inside, fled from the apartment. Anna Mae was still alive. She was rushed to the hospital. She had been stabbed multiple times, most of the stab wounds to her neck. In total, she had been stabbed 14 times. And even after an attack that brutal, she was conscious on the way to the hospital. But when asked who stabbed her, she didn't know. That becomes important because it tells you this was not someone whose name came to her immediately. According to what she was able to say, the woman who attacked her was a stranger. But before we dig deeper into this investigation, let's talk about who Anna Mae was. Anna Mae Florence was from Alabama, born and raised. According to her family, she was kind and had an infectious laugh. The kind of laugh that would make your day go better. And if you were having a bad one, it would instantly improve it. Her husband had been a pastor, and they had been married for 40 years. After he passed away, Anna Mae decided to leave Alabama and move to Columbus so she could be closer to family. She came from a large family, too. 14 children in all, 7 girls and 7 boys. So when we talk about Anna Mae, we're talking about someone who was deeply connected to people around her. She had family who loved her, family who checked in on her, and family who would spend decades waiting for justice. Back at the hospital, doctors performed emergency surgery to try to save her life. At the same time, detectives and the forensic team were securing the scene at her apartment. And the apartment told its own story. There was blood splattered throughout the home, and it was clear there had been a struggle between Anna Mae and her attacker. The apartment was in disarray, suggesting a violent confrontation. Investigators believe the attack started in the kitchen. They noted that the landline had been ripped off the wall. The cord hung loose near the wall during processing, another sign of how chaotic the struggle had become. There was a knife on the table with bloodstains on it, and detectives believed it came from Anna Mae's own kitchen. There was also a purse lying on the kitchen table. Inside, it was a security check and cash, all stained with blood. Investigators also found a mayonnaise jar that was emptied and cleaned out and believed it once contained money. So from early on, police believed they may be looking at an attempted robbery. But there was one more detail at the scene that would end up mattering for decades: a bloody handprint on the wall. The handprint would become one of the most important pieces of evidence in the entire case. Police processed fingerprints throughout the apartment. They did not believe the perpetrator had forced their way inside. Instead, they believed Anna Mae had let the person in. Detectives collected fingerprints from everyone who had legitimate access to her apartment so they could start ruling people out. And because this happened in 1987, this was not a case where detectives could lean on modern DNA testing the way they would today. This investigation would rely heavily on fingerprints, especially that bloody handprint. Back then, fingerprint comparisons were still heavily dependent on manual analysis and whatever records already existed in the system. A print could exist for years without ever finding a match. After surgery, Anna Mae survived for a couple of hours, but she eventually succumbed to her injuries and passed away. At that point, detectives needed to interview Alonzo and Lily in depth. Alonzo said he got a look at the suspect. He explained that while he had been trying to get into the apartment, the woman had apparently hidden behind the door, which would explain the bloody print behind the door that police saw later on. Then, as he rushed in to help Anna, she fled. He described the suspect as a young woman in her early 20s, around 5'2", but he did not recognize her. And Alonzo would always feel guilt because he felt like he could have done more. But the truth is, he did everything that he could do in the situation. Lily also heard something critical from Anna Mae's last conscious moments. While Anna Mae was still able to speak, Lily asked her, "Who did this?" Anna Mae said she didn't know the woman, but explained that the woman had come to her door asking for money for a funeral. According to Anna Mae, she let the woman inside and went to go get the money from her purse. She pulled out a couple of dollars, but the suspect saw there was more money in the purse and decided to rob her. Anna Mae said the woman struck her with the phone. A struggle followed, and Anna Mae grabbed a knife trying to defend herself, but was clearly overpowered. That gave detectives their first working theory. On the surface, this looked like a robbery that escalated into murder. But robbery explains taking. It does not always explain excess. 14 stab wounds, most of them to the neck, suggested something beyond theft entered that apartment too. And this is the first question that I want to ask you. When a crime begins as opportunism, but ends in overkill, what does that tell you about the person committing it? It begs to question a little further. If in fact it was a stranger, what made them participate in overkill? 14 stab wounds? And I think that's where you can turn to behavior. That would, by default, suggest rage. That the person who committed this crime was in a frenzy that caused them to stab a stranger 14 times and only walk away with just a little bit of money. It didn't make sense to detectives, but they needed to investigate further. So as we all know, one of the first things they did was canvass the area and ask neighbors whether they had seen or heard anything. And as we know, someone always knows something. One neighbor reported that a young woman had been knocking on doors asking for money and seemed either high or disoriented. That was significant because now detectives were not just looking for a young woman matching Alonzo's description. They were looking for someone who may have appeared impaired, desperate, or unstable while moving through the area asking strangers for help. And then that also touches on what I just talked about. Behavior. This person was enraged, and now with this new evidence that the person appeared either impaired, desperate, or high, well, that could explain the overkill that was seen in Anna Mae Florence's case. This information pointed police toward a young woman whose niece lived with her who was in the same building. Detectives interviewed the niece, but she had said she had been gone that morning during the attack at work. Police checked her alibi and cleared her. There was also a nearby detention school for teenage girls in the area. Investigators looked into whether someone from there fit the description. One girl did. Her name was Karen Green. During the attack, she had left the school and taken a bus to meet a relative. Detectives checked with the relative and ruled Karen out as a suspect as well. So they kept looking for anyone who matched the description. Anna Mae's family, meanwhile, held on to hope that detectives would bring the attacker to justice. They stayed involved in the case, offered a reward, and pushed for tips through Crime Stoppers. A few days later, a man called in with information. He said the assailant was a woman on drugs. According to him, she had got into trouble with a man who sold her cocaine. He said she had stolen a TV, got herself into even more trouble, and she needed money to repay him. He gave detectives a name, Danita. But what really got detectives' attention was not the accusation, but it was the details he shared. He claimed that after the homicide, there had been a party, and at that party, he saw Danita. He said she told him what occurred that day and also that she had scratches on the back of her hand, and he believed those were from Anna Mae grabbing her during the struggle. Then he mentioned something else, a security check and a change purse. That information had not been released to the public. So detectives immediately understood they needed to speak with this caller directly, in person. Either he was telling the truth about what he was hearing from the assailant, or he was closer to the crime than what he should have been. He didn't know Danita's address, but he called back the next day. This time, he gave his name, Odell. Detectives asked for his address, but he did not want them coming to his home. Instead, they arranged to meet him at the unemployment office where he said he had an appointment that same day. When they arrived, Odell didn't. And moments like this are maddening for investigators because uncertainty starts multiplying. Was he scared, manipulative, protecting someone, protecting himself? Still, his tip had given them something real to work with. So detectives began exploring Danita. They had law enforcement searching for her. They developed a possible address, obtained a search warrant, and set up surveillance. Eventually, they conducted a traffic stop on her car. During that stop, they were able to get her fingerprints and informed her they were investigating a homicide. Danita denied having anything to do with Anna Mae's murder. Detectives also observed injuries on her hand, but Danita claimed she got them at work. With no stronger evidence at the moment, they had to release her. Then they followed up on her alibi. Danita claimed she had been at work, but her employer told detectives she had actually been off of work for 3 weeks following a sexual assault. He even referenced an emergency room doctor that he spoke to because that doctor emphasized how serious the assault was and emphasized how serious the assault had supposedly been, saying she needed time in the hospital to recover. So detectives went to the hospital to find records supporting those injuries. They found nothing. No records backed up the story. None of her alibis checked out. Danita was being extremely deceptive, and police knew it. But deception is not the same thing as proof. Detectives felt she was not being forthcoming. But they still did not have enough evidence to build a case for the district attorney. So they turned back to Odell. They asked whether he would be willing to wear a wire. If Danita had really said what he claimed she said, maybe he could help them by getting something direct. But once again, when it came time to move forward, he disappeared. Crime Stoppers did give him an award, and detectives began to wonder whether he was partly in it for the reward money. But at the same time, some of what he had shared was clearly truthful. This is what made him so frustrating. He may have been opportunistic, but he also knew details he should not have known. Detectives still needed to find him and understand his role. They went to the address he had provided and found his aunt, who told them he didn't live there. They also went to the house where he said the party was, that same party where he claimed he met Danita after the homicide, but he didn't live there either. At that point, the case really hinged on the bloody handprint found in Anna Mae's apartment. Detectives had Danita's handprint sent to the lab for comparison with the bloody handprint from the scene. The results came back. No match. That was a major setback. Because just imagine, detectives canvass the area, they get some good intel from the witnesses that come forward, then they receive a call from this guy named Odell. Everything that he says seems to check out, but he doesn't want to meet up with detectives. And that by itself is shady. But when they follow up with Danita and get this handprint that they feel is substantial, they also find out that her alibi is shaky. But still, that's not enough evidence to build an entire case on what they know. Reach back to Odell. Odell doesn't show up again, but by this time, he's received his reward. He's probably shipped out of town. And when they check that handprint, what they thought would be the last thing to hinge this case on, they find out that it doesn't match. How incredibly frustrating, not just for detectives, but especially for the family. Because a lot of times we hear about cases where the case completely stalls out, it completely goes cold because some barriers. But this case very quickly moved full steam ahead with witnesses coming forward and people saying things that were pertinent to the case. But at every turn where they thought they would have the person responsible, which by all intents and purposes looks like Danita, they hit a brick wall. Now, detectives did not completely rule Danita out based upon this bloody handprint. And in most situations, especially today, you would be forced to, right? But they knew that her alibi wasn't credible. And so when you have two shifty details, when one is confirmed, like your handprint doesn't match, but your alibi seems shaky, well, you don't come out being the most credible person. She was deceptive. So now they were left wondering whether she was protecting the real perpetrator and whether Odell might be doing the same. A year passed. By 1988, the case had unfortunately gone cold. And this is one of the hardest transitions in any homicide investigation because a cold case does not just mean a lack of answers. It means paperwork boxed away, leads aging out, witnesses' memories thinning over time, or witnesses simply dying. It means a family learning to live beside uncertainty. Anna Mae's family stayed involved. They kept asking questions. Detectives sent the fingerprints off for analysis every year as technology improved, hoping that one day it would finally hit. But there was no match. And as we know, months turn into years, then years into decades. 25 years passed without justice for Anna Mae's family. Then, in 2012, Detective Taylor picked up the case. That is always such an interesting turning point in a cold case, right? Because another detective looking at old evidence with fresh eyes can change everything. Detective Taylor and others revisited every detail and reanalyzed every piece of evidence collected back in 1987. They ran the evidence through newer technology and waited for the results. By then, the old recordings and fingerprint files had survived decades of stalled leads and dead ends, but the evidence itself was still there. They also tried again to pursue Odell. With newer technology available, they were able to track him down. He was still living in Columbus. He seemed shocked to be found. His wife was present when detectives asked him questions, and he denied ever calling in a tip or ever going to police headquarters. Detective Taylor thought he might be hesitant because his wife was there. Maybe that was a detail of his past that he didn't want to revisit with her present. Police also took another look at Danita. The prints they had obtained from her back in 1987-88 were not considered good enough, so they tracked her down, brought her in again, and this time, because she had a warrant, they were easily able to get her down to the station. They reprinted her, and once again, she denied everything. But when those new prints came back, they still didn't match. At that point, detectives could eliminate Danita as the suspect. Now, after all these years have passed, they didn't have a suspect at all. So investigators had to go back and re-examine not only the evidence, but the entire story they had built around it. Quick pause just in case you're locked in right now. I want to make sure that you're subscribed to Murder in the Black and you press that bell icon so that you can keep up on our updates. For exclusive episodes and subscriber-only content, consider becoming a paid subscriber. Here's a little nugget. We have a 3-day free trial on Apple Podcasts just in case you want to figure out the lay of the land first before you commit. Storytime with Steph is back. That is where I present many true crime stories you won't always hear on our main feed, but the stories deserve to be told. You can watch that on whatever social media platform you enjoy us on. But I especially want those of you who are on TikTok to know that I'm back, and this is where we started our Murder in the Black community. One more quick favor. Make sure you leave a 5-star rating and review if you enjoy the work here. Let's get back into our story. They returned to Odell's house again, this time bringing recordings from 1987, those same recordings where they spoke to him on the phone. Detectives believed it was no way, after hearing these recordings, that Odell could deny his involvement in this case. But he did deny it. He claimed that the man on the recording was spelling out his name, and he argued that he did not know how to read or write. So it couldn't have been him. That forced detectives to think differently. Odell at the time was over 50 years old. Why would he lie about something as serious as not being able to read or write? Something that would bring him shame. Unless he was telling the truth and something bigger was at play. How many cases stay unsolved not because the evidence failed, but because someone built a story around the wrong person? And as I pose that question to you, it makes me immediately think of a case that I did earlier in the season where the evidence was solid. It was the wrong person because detectives were building their case around a sketch of a person that turned out not to be the correct one. And so the case itself was solid, but the person was wrong. And I think that happens a lot. Once detectives allow for that possibility, that they could be talking to the wrong person, that this Odell person was not, in fact, right, the whole case once again turned on its axis. So they started to believe that Odell in 1987 was not the Odell that they were speaking to today, but maybe the person calling in, meeting with police, and shaping the investigation from the edges was somebody else using his name. A catfish, if you will. That realization changes the gravity of this case. Investigators were no longer just revisiting evidence, they were revisiting identity itself. Odell then said, the real Odell, by the way, then said he believed he had been the victim of identity theft. And Odell, you would be right, brother. He started thinking about people who might do something like that and explained that when he went to the unemployment office around the time of the case and when this Odell person was talking to investigators, his cousin would be the person to take him and fill out his paperwork because remember, he couldn't read or write. He said if detectives took the tapes to his aunt, Marilyn, she might be able to help identify who it really was. This was the same Aunt Marilyn detectives had spoken to back in 1987 when they were trying to catch up with Odell. So detectives went to Marilyn's house. She was about to go to the casino, but they convinced her to talk. She walked down the hallway and came back with her son, Carl. Detectives played the tape for both of them. And it was like an aha moment. Carl admitted it wasn't him on the tape, but he looked over at his mother and said, "Mom, doesn't that sound like unanimously they said Chris?" And after 25 years, the borrowed name finally cracked open. A false identity had become so embedded in the investigation that it helped keep the truth at a distance for decades. Detectives asked where Chris was and learned he was a long-haul truck driver living in Arkansas. Chris was Marilyn's son. Marilyn gave them his cell phone number. They called him, and he denied knowing anything about the murder. But detectives knew they needed to speak with him face to face. Detective Taylor later went back to Marilyn's house, and she said that the next time Chris came into town, she would call. Sure enough, about a month later, she did. She told detectives Chris would be in town the next day. Then the next day, she called in and simply said, "He's here," and hung up the phone. Investigators made their way to her home. They sat down, and Marilyn told Chris to tell the truth. At first, Chris gave a story similar to what he had floated around the case for years. He again tried to pin it on Danita, not realizing that Danita had long since been cleared through the prints. Detectives told him that, "Hey, we know you're lying." Once again, his mother insisted that he say exactly who it was and what he knew. And that is when Chris gave them a new name, Zina Roberson. Now detectives had a new suspect, but they still did not know whether Chris was finally telling the truth. I mean, let's face it, Chris led them around a goose chase for years. He seemed hesitant. He said Zina had moved to Georgia and described her as a family friend. Even so, detectives now had something concrete to follow. Zina had once been arrested for shoplifting, which meant there was a copy of her fingerprints on file. They obtained those prints and compared them to the bloody handprint found in Anna Mae Florence's apartment. This time, it matched. After 25 years, the print that had sat silently at the center of the case finally had a name attached to it, Zina Roberson. Although they had their suspect, they still needed to find her. Detectives believed she was in Rome, Georgia, where she had picked up the shoplifting charge. They traveled there and arrived at her apartment. She seemed surprised to see them, but also a little like she had been expecting the visit. Detectives confronted her with the 1987 murder. She denied it and claimed she had never been in Anna Mae's apartment. Then she immediately asked for a lawyer. On August 15th, 2013, Zina Roberson was charged with first-degree murder of Anna Mae Florence. For Anna Mae Florence's family, there was finally some sense of vindication in seeing someone held accountable. Investigators learned that Zina had been struggling with drug addiction around that time. So she chose that apartment where Anna Mae lived because older people were there, and she believed an elderly person would be sympathetic to her story about needing money for a loved one's funeral. Anna Mae gave her a small amount of money, but Zina became convinced she had more. She asked to use the telephone, which gained her entry into Anna Mae's apartment. Then Zina struck Anna Mae with the telephone. A struggle followed. Anna Mae tried to defend herself with a knife, but Zina overpowered her and stabbed her repeatedly. Detectives believe the attack was interrupted when Anna Mae's family arrived. Police did not believe Zina went there intending to kill Anna Mae, but she did. And sometimes that is the terrifying reality of violence. How quickly manipulation can become irreversible harm. Zina took a plea deal and was sentenced to 15 years in prison. When she is released, she will be in her 70s. And that leaves a lot to sit with. Because yes, there was accountability, but it came a quarter century later. 25 years is a long time to live with silence, uncertainty, and the possibility that the person responsible may never be named. Takeaway. What stays with me in this case is how much rested on one piece of evidence that never stopped mattering. That bloody handprint was there from the beginning. It was there in 1987. It was there when the case went cold. It was there through the years when every new attempt came back empty. It was also there when Detective Taylor picked back up the case in 2012. The print did not change. The science did. Detectives changed. Technology evolved. The assumptions changed. And the names attached to the story even changed. But the print stayed the same. And I think that is what makes this case so striking. The truth was sitting there the whole time, but the world around it had to catch up before anyone could fully hear what it was saying. This case also leaves you thinking about how easily decency can be exploited. Anna Mae was 77 years old, living in her own home, a woman who had already lived a full life, buried her husband, moved to be closer to the people she loved. She should have been able to answer the door and offer a little kindness without putting her life at risk. Instead, someone used a story about needing help, needing money for a funeral to get inside. That makes this case extremely painful. It was the violence, but it also was the way compassion was weaponized against her. And maybe that is one of the hardest things about cold cases. Realizing the truth may have existed the entire time, just out of reach. Cold cases can make people think nobody cared or that everybody gave up. But that's not always what happens. Sometimes a case goes cold because the evidence outlives the tools available to interpret it. Sometimes it goes cold because somebody lied just well enough to push investigators in the wrong direction. And sometimes it goes cold because the truth is already in the file, but not yet reachable. Anna Mae Florence's case is a strong reminder that unsolved does not always mean unsolvable. Sometimes it's unfinished, it means waiting, and in this case, after all the time, the truth finally caught up. Not quickly or cleanly, and not in a way that could undo what happened, but it did catch up. Anna Mae Florence should be remembered for the life she lived, the family who loved her, the kindness people remembered in her, and the peace she should have been allowed to keep in her own home. Instead, her family spent decades waiting for the truth to emerge from underneath the lies. borrowed names, and years of silence. And eventually, it did. That'll do it for today's episode. Last Thursday, I did go live with my executive producer. That's an inside joke if you watched the live. And we discussed the Carnell Walker case for a minute, but we very quickly moved on to true crime and current news. And that's where I gave an in-depth update about the Celeste Rivas Hernandez case, and I briefly talked about the Ashley Janae case. If at all you're interested, and if you ever miss when MIB goes live, make sure you're subscribed to Murder in the Black on YouTube. There's a live tab there. You can watch any recordings where we have gone live. And I'll also be linking our recent live across our platforms for those who missed it and are interested in what the updates were. I do think I'll start going live once a month to discuss true crime and current news. It's a chance for us to interact with each other a little more and for me to actually hear what y'all think about these cases and updates in real time. I want to encourage you, if you ever see a headline that catches your eyes or there's a true crime case that is occurring within your community, you don't have to wait until it has finality, meaning it has gone to court and their sentencing has been rendered. You can simply send me an article via DM. You guys know I'm really good about checking DMs and getting back in contact with you. I want to hear from you because sometimes you will send me an article. I haven't heard about it, and it's a chance for me to feature it in our true crime and current news segment on Murder in the Black. Last, but certainly not least, I have officially launched the trailer for What I Didn't See. If you haven't heard that, simply go back to your feed and you should see that trailer. It is an original psychological thriller audio series exclusively for Murder in the Black. The first episode drops May 10th. And if you like what you hear, you will have to subscribe to the paid subscription tier to gain access. There's also a 3-day free trial available on Apple Podcasts in case you want to figure out everything first. But I want to encourage you guys to make sure you check that out. It is definitely a work of love, and I think you'll love it. Until next time, this is Murder in the Black. I'll see you next week.